It wasn't that long ago when the entire world was preparing for a massive shift into electric vehicles. Back in 2021, General Motors was one of the first major automakers to pledge to make the transition to 100% electric vehicles by the year 2035. Ford pledged something similar but with a 2040 timeline. Mercedes claimed that by the year 2025, there would be an electric variant for all models in their lineup. And these are just a few of the examples. But it wasn't just automakers pledging to go full electric. Our government was pushing it as well, with the EPA and the Biden administration pushing for some of the most aggressive pollution standards we've ever seen, revamping the EV tax credit and putting pressure on automakers to make the pledges I just outlined. It was even stated that by year 2030, half of all vehicles sold would be electric. It truly felt as though we were on the cusp of a massive change. Automakers were on board, tax incentives were there, and it seemed, at least briefly, that consumer demand was there as well. EVs were officially taking over. But then abruptly, last year, the sentiment surrounding electric vehicles seemed to change virtually overnight. And while it is very difficult to pinpoint when exactly this downward shift for EVs started, one of the major catalysts was and is Tesla price cuts. Tesla began lowering their prices in December of 2022 with what started as a seemingly temporary discount to help holiday sales and to counteract the EV tax credit, which at the time was being revamped. But then in January of 2023, the official price cuts began and continued throughout the year. This was done to increase sales, and to Tesla's credit, it actually did work. But this was really the first major red flag that really pointed to the fact that consumer demand surrounding EVs was declining. And throughout 2023, more dominoes began to fall. By mid-2023, Ford had pulled back their EV target. By Q3, they had announced they were losing $36,000 on every EV that they sold, and by 2024, they had lowered production guidance on some of their most successful EVs, like the Ford F-150 Lightning. GM, which all things considered is doing quite well with their shift to EVs, has announced that they're pivoting their plan to produce 400,000 electric vehicles by 2024, and instead they'll be pivoting to a focus of EVs and hybrids. While Mercedes has recently come out with a public plan to have EVs and gas cars coexist, saying that an all-EV world just isn't a reality. And believe it or not, even the EPA is looking at pulling back on their emission rules and standards. And as of late 2023, EVs were selling at an overall slower pace than gas cars. Now, before we dive into what went wrong with EVs, it is important to emphasize that while EV growth has slowed down, and all things considered, it has been disappointing, the EV market is in fact growing. And while there were a lot of hurdles that the EV market experienced in 2023, a lot of good things did happen as well. For example, according to Bloomberg, the EV market is expected to grow 22% this year, and last year it grew 47%, while the year before that it grew by 60%. The amount of new EVs sold as a percentage of total new cars sold is also expected to grow. In fact, it's expected to grow more in 2024 than it has in previous years. And EV registrations surpassed 1.1 million last year in the US, which is the largest that we've ever seen. And while Tesla price cuts were certainly a result of slowing demand, which is bad for the EV market overall, these price cuts also have made EVs, specifically Teslas, more affordable than ever. I say all of this because while this video is focusing on what went wrong with the EV market and some of the major hurdles that are preventing customers from buying, it would also be extremely misleading and untrue for me to state that the EV market is in shambles, because it absolutely isn't. So again, we have to ask, why is the EV market not growing as fast as we expected? And one of the major hurdles that consumers are facing is charging infrastructure, and range anxiety. According to a McKinsey study done last month, 42% of consumers aren't willing to make the shift to EVs until availability of charging stations are equal to the availability of gas stations. But according to a different study done last year, the US averages about 104 gas pumps per 1,000 miles of road, compared to just 22 EV charging ports for that same distance. So we are quite a ways away from making charging ports and gas stations equal in quantity. And we also have to take into consideration the fact that charging ports aren't equal across the entire United States. And while the majority of EV charging does take place at home, in fact 80% of EV charging is done at home, this can also alienate a huge portion of consumers, like those that live in apartments, dorms, or just don't have a garage. And this percent of the population can be anywhere between 20 to 40% of consumers, depending on what statistic you're looking at. The fact is, EV charging is a massive barrier for consumers. And according to a Cox Automotive study, 32% of consumers who were considering an EV cited lack of charging stations in my area as a barrier to purchase. According to a Consumer Report study done in April, it found that charging logistics and purchase price price were the two biggest factors holding consumers back. And according to a poll done by the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, they found that 47% of U.S. adults said they're not likely they would buy an EV as their next car, with nearly 80% saying that lack of charging stations was a factor. The reality is, EV charging and range anxiety, it is a major hurdle whenever it comes to convincing consumers to make the leap into electric cars. And this is really holding back mainstream adoption whenever it comes to EVs. And the unfortunate thing is that there is no easy solution to this problem. And while EV charging is definitely the biggest barrier holding back consumers, it also isn't the only thing either. Another factor could potentially be, oddly enough, the EV tax credit itself, which is ironic because the EV tax credit is designed to get people to buy electric cars. The EV tax credit was introduced years ago, back in the early days of Tesla and the Toyota Prius, and the point of the EV tax credit at the time was a way to incentivize automakers to produce EVs as well as consumers to buy them. Whenever the EV tax credit was initially rolled out, it was actually done in a sliding scale based on production numbers. So people who were early adopters into EVs would get the full tax credit, while people that adopted them later on would get either portions or would potentially get none of the tax credit. And so as a result of this, as EVs became more and more mainstream, less and less people were actually getting the tax credit. As a result of this, in the last couple of years, a revamped tax credit was introduced, giving car buyers a new opportunity to claim a tax incentive. The problem, though, is that this tax credit is extremely confusing. The rules change often, resulting in consumers not really understanding which cars qualify, let alone how to actually get the credit. The eligibility for the credit is based on sourcing of EV parts, as well as manufacturing location and even size and price of the car. Some cars qualify for the full $7,500, others qualify for just half, and others qualify for none of it. My job is literally to keep up with automotive news, and even I find the EV tax credit to be confusing. And as I'm recording this video, I'm not 100% sure which cars currently qualify and which ones don't. So how can we expect the average American who may not buy a lot of cars, may not know how to navigate the tax system, or may not understand how tax credits work, how can we expect for them to navigate it? And while there aren't any official polls or studies done on this topic, whenever I was researching for this video, there were a number of articles that I found suggesting that possibly the complexity of the EV tax credit may be turning off EV buyers altogether. And truthfully, I think that there's merit to this belief. And while we're on the topic of the tax credit, we also can't ignore the fact that vehicle price is absolutely playing a factor here as well, especially in this car market. The car market is slowing down, and this is in turn causing the EV market to slow down. I mean, it would be unrealistic for us to expect for the EV market to skyrocket whenever the overall car market is trending in the opposite direction. But in 2023, the car market declined by more than 10%. Higher interest rates made it more expensive to borrow money for a car, and tightening lending standards made it harder to get approved. And the fact that EVs are in general more expensive than gas cars, well, that doesn't help it either. For example, the average cost of an EV last year, according to Kelley Blue Book, was about $53,000, while the average cost of a new gas car was about $48,000. And while the EV tax credit is designed to help counteract this difference, it doesn't help if it's too confusing to actually use. At the end of the day, there are a variety of different reasons why people are skeptical of EVs, from battery degradation and replacement, cost of the car itself, as well as charging and range anxiety. And what I find extremely interesting isn't the fact that consumers are skeptical of EVs because of these things, it's instead the fact that automakers had just totally missed the mark on what consumers would be skeptical about. The amount of confidence that automakers and even the government had that Americans would adopt electric vehicles was pretty astounding. And it's interesting to see how all in automakers were on EVs and how quickly they've pulled out of that. And while we definitely can't place all of the blames on EVs themselves and the outlook of the EV market, because some of the blame absolutely has to be placed on the car market and economic outlook, we do have to wonder how automakers missed the mark this much. Because I think even in perfect conditions, EVs wouldn't have been adopted as quickly as automakers are hoping they would be. And truthfully, with all of this skepticism, the question is coming up that maybe EVs aren't the future after all, or at least not the entire future. Maybe the future is in fact hybrids. This is something GM has spoken about recently, Mercedes has also leaned into, and Toyota has been on this hill since the beginning. EVs are in general more flexible, more dynamic, and they have more options than electric cars. According to a Consumer Reports study done last year, they're also more reliable as well. But regardless of the role that EVs or hybrids play in the future, the fact is people are skeptical of EVs, and the fact that we're having a declining car market, declining demand for buying cars, and an economy that is leaving consumers unsure about the future, all of these factors are ultimately why we've seen a true 180 shift shift between 2021 and 2022 and today. And whether this is just a bump in the road to an all-electric vehicle future, or if this is a sign that EVs are in fact not the future, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.